Thank you so much. I must say that I enjoyed that presentation. And of course, it's indeed a pleasure for me to be here today. As Dr. Short really went through her presentation, I remembered Hurricane Gilbert, and I remembered how that emergency situation changed my life. That was the year I entered Teachers College. So therefore, in emergency crisis, there are some good things that will come out of it, especially as it relates to innovation. So let me say thanks for the introduction, and it's indeed a pleasure for me to be here. The topic today is very critical to me: differentiating learning and teaching instructions as it relates to synchronous and asynchronous lessons. But I want to say that as we look at it, I want to reflect on my time when I started school in Jamaica. In my time, there was practically limited differentiated practices. You know, as I went to school in my early days, attending high school, I realized that I had severe asthma. On one occasion, I almost thought I would die. In those days, children would not have access to what we call a pump or an inhaler at this point in time. So we took tablets, and these tablets would take some time to digest in our system to give us some sense of relief. On one occasion, I was rushed to the Cornwall Regional Hospital in Jamaica. And after spending a day there, I was sent home, still breathless, still unable to tie my shoelace, still unable to get out of bed. I was always in a recovery position. After a few days, I recovered and went back to school. On returning to school, I was gifted with various tests. I was not prepared for these tests. So you know what happened? My grades were zero. In the context of differentiated practices, inclusive practices, this would not be so, because the teacher would understand the need to maximize learning of all students. Using differentiated instructions, the teacher would scaffold me to reach mastery of the content that was taught before. Therefore, it is in mind with this thought that I want to say to you, I want to explore the objectives today. I want to provide an overview of the context as it relates to Caribbean synchronous and asynchronous teaching and learning online as it relates to our present context. We are in a really unique context as outlined earlier. I want to define the term differentiated instructions, and I want to highlight the components that must be considered as you move forward in using differentiated instructions. I am writing this article with a friend of mine, and we have written several articles, and this one is in press. And in this article, we suggest that the COVID pandemic forced teachers to make drastic changes from one modality to the next, and to consider technological extensions of learning spaces. Remember, at this point, teacher training in the Caribbean and globally did not reflect explicit instructions as it relates to teaching online. However, many of these changes were not informed by research-based investigations. And of course, the pedagogical practices were simply not adequate. Many of the methods used in face-to-face was somewhat just transferred over to the online space. My question to you, to what extent do you agree with the above statement? And I think when I look at the context, I want for us to consider the different learners that we have in our classes today. You know, as we consider our presentation context, let me consider 4 possible students that we could have in our class at any level. A student who has an educational provision, that's an IEP, right? That's possible. We could have another set of students who are gifted and talented in that subject area. Note that subject area, because a student who is gifted and talented in one area might struggle in the next area. And another set of students might be the ones just struggling with the new content. And of course, you leave the student out at times, this average student who just passed to get the 50 to show limited mastery of the content. When we look at the traditional model of teaching, we can say that it operated in a physical space. So therefore, we could make adjustments on the fly. But what COVID has taught us is that we have to make the necessary modifications. Now, we have realized when we look at the literature that not much has been said about synchronous teaching and learning. Yes, they talk about inclusion and diversity, which is a subset of this sort of teaching and learning, but we have not gone in depth to explore explicit strategies as it relates to differentiated instructions in the online learning environment. So I want to give that in context because we are in a unique position and we are practically developing the knowledge as it relates to synchronous and asynchronous teaching strategies as we go on the fly. Now, when we look at synchronous teaching and learning, we have to make the connection. What is synchronous teaching? Or what's a synchronous lesson? A synchronous lesson takes place in real time. We're using video, we're using Zoom. We can read those questions, we can pose those questions in real time, and we can use technology that provides live interaction. Now, if we pull ourselves away, we realize that asynchronous teaching and learning occurs in different time. It is online. You do not get an immediate response. There is some interaction, but you're not sure to get the interaction. So how do we now say to ourselves, what are the best methods to look forward in designing this sort of learning, that active learning can take place? Because I think it's important to understand the importance of engaging students so they can be passionate and be active participants, whether it is in synchronous environment or asynchronous environment. Now, if I pose the question to you, what is differentiation? I want to pause for 10 seconds or so for you to say to yourself, what word comes to mind? Taylor did some research with a group of teachers, and he went on to say that it's providing challenging tasks to individuals, creating that low threat environment to ensure that all learners succeed. It's about scaffolding without reducing expectations, because I think that's important. Not because you set a task for an individual student who is not reaching the level of mastery that you have, you should have low expectations. And it's also about inclusive teaching and learning. That's fundamental what he found out. So when we look at the whole process of differentiating a lesson, whether it be synchronous or asynchronous formation, we have to consider these thoughts by these teachers. Now, I want us to consider some key principles as it relates to differentiation. Differentiation requires a mindset for inclusion and diversity. They cannot be separated. It also requires an environment that supports the diversity of the learner. And if we are thinking about differentiation, we must have a quality curriculum. The curriculum should be designed in such a way that it gives consideration to all aspects of that population. As we move forward, we also must realize that it must have a structural approach of assessment to inform the teaching and learning process. So if you're thinking about differentiation, you have to think about these terms. And of course, you're managing students' learning during the process. So you must have knowledge of the student's learning profile. So differentiation, in summary, is an approach that the teacher will use to maximize the learning of all students within the asynchronous learning space and the synchronous learning space, regardless of the student's learning status. The student has an accommodation, and accommodation means special needs, or the student needs to be challenged to another level, because we have to make sure that we do that. The reality is that the utilization of one strategy when it comes on to differentiation will not work, because there are several strategies that will need to be employed to ensure that we maximize these learning spaces. I want to also state and stress that differentiation is not about individualized teaching, but a process or framework that we can adjust the content, what students will learn, the process, how students will learn, and the product, how students will demonstrate their learning. In addition, It requires us to take in consideration the learning space or place, and this is going to be online. Previously, when you looked at the connection of differentiated practices, it always referenced the face-to-face context. Limited consideration was given to online. When we talk about differentiated instructions in a lesson, whether it be synchronous or asynchronous, we must understand that it's different from universal design for learning. Universal design for learning takes place at the curriculum level. But within the context of differentiation, the teacher is making changes as the teacher is teaching the set of students to ensure that they are accommodated and to ensure that modifications are made to the curriculum. Notwithstanding, I want to say that the curriculum, of course, in many cases will provide additional resources. Now, as we look at it, and I said to you, it is not designing 26 lessons for 26 students, and you're saying to me, I thought it was that, because some educators think that way. But I'm going to give a little warning for that mindset. Now, as an educator, we should ensure that we avoid the one-size-fits-all approach. I would say that use an approach that tailors instructions for groups of students with similar skills or needs. And why do I say this? My perspective of education is that we tend to look at the gifted and talented. You know, that student is gifted. We tend to look at the student who is failing. Okay, that student needs some support to ensure that they don't get a failing grade. And we look at the student who is a special needs student, one with a statement, a legal statement that requires support. But no one sort of considers the student that's between that needs to be pushed to the next level. So what I am saying at this point, differentiation is relevant at any level of the teaching spectrum, whether it be mainstream classroom setting, special needs context, in a mixed ability, or if some people are still streaming students, it's necessary. And also, you might find it strange that I've included this one-to-one setting. And one-to-one setting is very important. Let me explicitly explain my position for this. Differentiation of instructions in a lesson, synchronous lesson, or asynchronous lesson is not a pass not to provide one-to-one instructions to a student when necessary. I have seen several educators argue they provide differentiated instructions, so there is no need to do one-to-one support. I am urging you, do not put yourself in a position where you are ignoring the student that will need that one-to-one support. As I look forward, I want to also present to you a few things that will be necessary for any framework that requires differentiated framework, that is. First, in order to begin implementing a framework for differentiation of instructions in a lesson online, you must know your students. In knowing your students, you'll be able to tell their readiness for the subject. And I think the readiness was outlined by Dr. Short a while ago. You can access students' readiness by oral discussions, test, and sample work. In addition, you can also ensure that the student is made aware of what content they need to cover. In respect to this, you have to understand also the need to know or have knowledge of your students' interests. That's important, because without this knowledge, how will you sustain and gain the students' interest? And most importantly, the need to understand the learning profiles of your students. That's important, because if you're going to plan instructions, you must consider the background of the students and what form will their learning make progress, the strategies that you will need to use, and the level of success they've had over the past. So it's important to do this. So when we consider knowing your students, that's one stage of differentiation, of course. We have to move to another stage, the differentiation activity. Differentiation of instruction means tailoring instructions to meet individual needs. And within the framework, when we talk about differentiation, we can differentiate by doing several things here. First, content. We can differentiate the content, the skills that students will need to master. So we have the knowledge that they need to cover. So we have to consider, how are we going to differentiate content? Then content is one thing. Then we have to think about the process. What activities are we going to differentiate to ensure that students can master the content? So you have to think about how you're going to do the content and the level or grouping necessary. You have to think about the process and, of course, the method students will use to demonstrate learning. And I saw where our last presenter was asked a question regarding examination, but I want to touch on that a little later because I think that's important. But one part often forgotten within the context of online is the learning environment. And we have to see how we're going to design that space to ensure that we enhance the principles of differentiation as outlined earlier. So these are important factors: content, process, product, and the learning environment. And I want to just give an overview of some of the strategies that we can use to ensure that these are gained as we go through. Now, when we look at content, we're talking about tiering the content in such a way that students complete activities. However, the content is varied based on difficulty. So you have to know the student's readiness. You have to know their interest. You have to understand their learning profile. And I would say that this sort of strategy can be used in a synchronous environment as well as asynchronous environment. Within the topic or area of presentation styles, I think when you look at presentation styles, you're thinking more of their interest. I would say that in a dominant place, I would have it working well in the synchronous environment as well as asynchronous. However, for the synchronous pathway, I would say have many sections where the teacher will explain and then use guided instructions throughout. However, there should be opportunities within the presentation style in the synchronous session that allow students to ask questions. Another point that I want to also mention is that teachers can move the differentiation process by asking questions at different levels to ensure that students are aware of what needs to be done in that context. And of course, if you're using presentation style, I would say record your presentations and put it in the asynchronous section of your course or lesson that students have access to it. I want to say that when you look at scaffolding, I think scaffolding is important at all levels: readiness, interest, learning profile. I think it's important, but not as important within the context of both. Because at every level, a student might need to be scaffolded to move from the high level to maybe another level. And that moves to another level regardless of where the student is. Because I think you always have to challenge students wherever they are on the spectrum. So as we think about content, we move to the process. You know, one of the things I've realized that we have to challenge students in a way that even if they're comfortable, we're challenging them to move to the next level. In doing so, the teacher can assign tasks based on groupings. And I think it's important that you really consider the groups. You know, it's easy for me to just say, you know what, I'm just going to allow the computer to just place students in groups. But is that effective pedagogical practice? I would say no. So when I think about that sort of grouping, we have to consider how we're going to do it. So I think we can look at the activities and we can challenge students based on the variation of the activities at the synchronous pathway as well as asynchronous. And when we look at the learning space, we have to think about the readiness. Provide online learning space for students so that they can develop their learning communities. Students love to have this sort of communication online, especially now in our digital world. We realize that so many students will be using their phones to communicate, from K to 12, primary school to high school, as they would say in the Caribbean, to university. A lot of students are using the learning space to even exchange ideas. And I think this can be beneficial at all levels. Within the context of that too, I think it's important to think about interactive content. And why do I say that it's more important to asynchronous? Because many times teachers tend to put the content in and don't think about interaction necessary. We know in order for students to progress, they must be active participants in their learning. Hence, we have to do some level of interactive content, whether it be a game or something to allow them to be part of what they're doing. I know in the Caribbean you might not have this, but there's a pathway called personalized adaptive learning that's using computer based to set certain standards for students. And if they're not reaching mastery, it will give them an array of options to demonstrate that mastery. Notwithstanding, we still need to embody resources in our class. And when we look at another strategy in the process, we can use graphic organizers. And I think that's a wonderful way of moving forward too. Allow students to gather and organize their information as well as demonstrate their learning and understanding of certain things. And I think that is so important. Many times you ask someone to explain something and they can't, but you ask them to maybe draw a diagram or not do it in a written form, but orally, that's good. And I want to move to my last aspect of it, and I think is the product, which brings us to mind assessment. Who likes to hear the word assessment? Well, to be honest, when I hear the word assessment, I somewhat get nervous if I'm the one being assessed. How do we demonstrate students' learning? For far too long, the assessment of online learning spaces has been sort of designed for group discussions, group projects, and the cover for everything, the grand quiz. We're using quizzes to assess everything. And if we can't afford it, we let them write a short response. A teacher using differentiated system within their synchronous lesson or asynchronous lesson would provide an assessment that is challenging using clear directions and instructions. In addition, the teacher would ensure that the product being used for assessment is connected to real world. And our last speaker mentioned that. When we think about this, we have to think, how are we going to tailor the product that will allow students to demonstrate their learning using a range of artifacts? I don't know if you ever seen this picture with someone doing an assessment and he's asking the animals to climb a tree, and there's a monkey, an elephant, a dog, a cat. Of course, the only animal able to complete that assessment rather would be, of course, the monkey. Maybe the cat would run up the tree, right? So we do have two. So what I'm saying, it must be relevant. So as I state to you, you must consider the readiness of the student, the interest, and of course, within the context, you can always use it within the synchronous and asynchronous lessons when you're engaged. And what are some of these products that you can think about? You know, if you ask a student to write an essay and they have a language problem and they are not good at writing essays, and you ask another to write something else and they might not have the competency, why not ask for a video? If you wanted someone to bring a concept across, why ask them to write when they could do a poster to explain? If you wanted someone to demonstrate a process, why not ask them to build something rather than draw something? So what I am saying actually here is to use different products to kind of measure the level of mastery. Be creative. Avoid the one size fit all for all your students. You know, if we give students quizzes and so forth just to assess all the time, you know, some students might just have a phobia with these sort of quiz. I know individuals that practically freeze, taken exams how many times, but when you ask them and fail, but when you ask them about the content, they can explain clearly. It means that's not their preference as it relates to the assessment. But when I went to Jamaica a few years ago, I went into a classroom and I had to hold my head down to avoid my head being hit by objects hanging from the ceiling in that classroom. While the situation was somewhat different in the United States and England, one key factor that was present, that all these spaces had objects, artifacts present that students could look at. So when we think about environment, we have to say, how are we going to create a space online, synchronous lesson or asynchronous lesson, that will allow us to foster an environment that is stimulating and of course of interest. Yes, we can have group discussions, and we have to think about the learning profile. Provide resources for students, especially in the synchronous and asynchronous setting. Learning space organization. In the synchronous session, you are the leader of that engagement. While I would say there's some level of organization necessary, within the context of asynchronous, that is more than important. Because if it's not organized properly, students don't even know what to do. It also organizes the students' learning. So students know exactly systematically what they need to do. So be accommodating. And remember, within these spaces too, there must be an atmosphere that students can build a community of learning. And you must provide the resources necessary. And if you are able to design the environment in such a way, then students will feel relaxed and they can go through the work and they will know what resource you have placed for them. And you can group the resources based on mastery. You know, if you finish this block of work, you move to the next block of work. And of course, if you have a system that locks them out, that is fine. So they have to reach mastery before they move on to the next level. So these are some ideas that I want to throw out. So when we talk about evaluation in the differentiated framework, we're using assessment because it's important that we have to assess. We have to assess because we want to assess to ensure the student can move to the next level. But in our assessment, we must be fair. It's important to consider diverse modes that students will, of course, be assessed. And when we look further too, we're looking at the concept of grade adjustment. Grades assigned must reflect students' knowledge, effort in relation to what was taught. You know, you gave an A, but I don't think the person mastered it. No, be honest. You know, I've always told my students, you know, honesty is the best policy. If I give you a C, it means that no one will look at your work and give it less than a C, but maybe a B possible. You know, sometimes we're harder at the students we teach. Now, I put the word multiple attempts here because as educators, when we assess in a differentiated framework within the asynchronous and synchronous situation, we must understand that students learn at different rate. Therefore, if a student has not gained the competence required, then the student must be allowed to revisit the lesson under the guidance of teacher and of course be assessed again. That might be very difficult, but designing your course or your space in the synchronous session or asynchronous lesson should give opportunities that students can learn from their mistake. And don't be afraid to do what? Support your students. Remember, many students are not at the level required for competency and they will need your support. Therefore, offer additional support to assist students. This could simply mean just giving some resources that will assist them. Now I come to the point where we talk about group grades, right? If you are like me, you must have been in a group at some point in your life where some group member or members did not do their task, but got an A just like you. And you would have written to the tutor or professor stating that, you know what, Mary or John did not do the work and got the same grade as I did. I want to say that in many institutions, group work now has become a pathway to reduce grading and workload. And I'm saying to myself, group work is good because we talk about collaborative learning and learning together, and it's all good. But when it comes to assessment, when you give a group a grade for mastery and everyone gets an A, and that person did not play his or her part in that group activity, gets an A, he or she has shown no mastery. So therefore, we have to be very careful when we sign up to do these sort of activities with our students, because we want to ensure that we are fair, honest, and true to everyone. And if a student has not gained mastery in that area, then the grade should be reflecting that level. So some educators have thought that group work in this context should be avoided. And of course, if you are in the United States or anywhere else, UK, there's a concept of extra credit. If you're going to give extra mark for a task or anything, it must be connected to what the student need to have mastered. So these are some components that I want you to consider in differentiating your activities in a synchronous lesson or asynchronous lesson. We talk about differentiation, and one of the things that I've always said in the past is that we must be able to communicate with parents. Communication to parents will be important. They must understand what you're doing. You must tell them that you are tailoring your instructions to ensure that their child is included. And this will require for you to explain the strategies. And I think children and the students that we teach should also know. Be open to questions, because sometimes parents do not even understand. Avoid those big words, right? That they won't. Differentiation. If you said to a parent, I'm going to differentiate my lesson to accommodate your child, they might not understand. But you can say, I'm going to plan my activities so your child can understand what I'm doing. That's different. As I said before, when it comes on to this, we have to be ready. Our students have to be ready. We have to understand their interest, know their learning profile. And once we can do this, we can move to the model of differentiation by content, process, product, and learning environment. And of course, I want to bring my final thoughts as I see time is running at this point in time. Be explicit about your instructions. Critically evaluate your resources that you're selecting when you are differentiating. And I have here, don't talk too much. Be aware that complex language can create comprehension issues. And I bring this into context to once I was teaching at a school, and I had this young man, he had a special need, and the teacher said to him, I want you to go down to Miss Karen and tell her that here's the money for the ice cream I took last week. And when she's finished, tell her that I want to see her after she's finished working in the canteen. The young man went down there and told Miss Karen that the teacher had given him money to buy ice cream. Weeks after, the teacher questioned Miss Karen about not getting a confirmation, and she was told that the young man had used the money to purchase ice cream. So we have to be very careful. I did not say the guy did anything wrong, because he was given an instruction and he understood the first part. Take the money down to Miss Karen, and in his mind he was saying, I'm going to buy ice cream. So just be mindful of that. Connect prior knowledge. That's important to ensuring that you're setting that foundation. Be ready to repeat and revise. Sometimes differentiation will require you to make changes on the spot. You know, the best way to find where students are is to post questions, whether in a discussion forum, online, or in your live session. Ask questions to ensure that they are following and they are moving forward. It doesn't make sense moving to step 3 when they have not understood step 1. Be predictable. Don't change up your learning environment in the asynchronous platform without having told students what you're doing, or changing from last week your format to the next week. Break up the task in segments that can be understood and followed. Don't be afraid to model task and process that you're going to do in that session or lesson. At this point, let me say it was my pleasure presenting to you, and I will anticipate your questions as we talk about differentiated instructions in asynchronous and synchronous lessons.